Our speaker this morning is Dr. Edward Payne, Senior Curator of Spanish Art at the Auckland Castle Trust in England. Prior to his work at Auckland Castle, Ed served as the inaugural Meadows Mellon Prado Curatorial Fellow here at the Meadows Museum from 2014 to 2016. And prior to that, as the Moore Curatorial Fellow in Drawings and Prints at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. At the Morgan, Ed curated Visions and Nightmares, 4 Centuries of Spanish Drawings, and he was a contributor to the catalog Goya, The Witches and Old Women album, which accompanied the exhibition of the same title at the Courtauld Gallery in 2015. A 2004 graduate of the University of London Institute in Paris, where he majored in French, Ed completed an MA in Art History in 2005 at the University of London's Courtauld Institute of Art. In 2012, he earned a PhD in art history from the Courtauld, where he wrote a thesis entitled Violence and Corporeality in the Art of Jusepe de Ribera. This study served as the point of departure for an exhibition he is co-curating with Dr. Javier Bray titled Ribera, The Art of Violence, scheduled to open at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London in October of 2018. Together with Dr. Gabriela Finaldi of the National Gallery in London and Elena Senelmore from the Museo Nacional del Prado in Madrid, Dr. Payne was a contributor to the Catalogue Raisonné of Ribera drawings, and he is the curator of our accompanying exhibition, Between Heaven and Hell, The Drawings of Jusepe Ribera. His lecture today, Sublime and Grotesque, Ribera and the Art of Drawing, will focus on a selection of drawings featured in the catalog, and this will be followed by an informal tour in the exhibition. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward Payne.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to see you all again. It's great to be back in Dallas, great to be back at the Meadows, and it was a real privilege for me to take part in this exhibition and to be a contributor to the Catalogue Raisonné. So I'd like to begin by thanking Gabriele Finaldi for inviting me to assist him on the catalogue, to Mark for inviting me to curate the exhibition, and I'd like to thank all of my colleagues here at the Meadows Museum, some of whom are with us this morning, for all of their hard work in putting this exhibition together. So, without further ado, let us begin. A prolific draftsman, outstanding painter, and influential printmaker, Jusepe de Ribera was one of the leading artists of the Spanish Golden Age. He was born in Játiva, a small town near Valencia, in 1591, and he spent most of his life in Naples, which was a Spanish territory in the 17th century. This 18th century portrait engraving depicts Ribera not as a painter, but as a graphic artist. The sitter presents to the viewer a work on paper, representing a grotesque head. The artist's palette and brushes are cast in shadow, his etching tools illuminated on the table. The object reproduced in the engraving is Ribera's print of the large grotesque head, which he executed around 1622, and which represents a subject that he depicted in numerous drawings throughout his career. The juxtaposition of the deformed grotesque head with the artist's gentlemanly head is striking, and it points to the tensions between the ugly and the beautiful, the sublime and the grotesque, which permeate Ribera's art. In his Lives of the Eminent Spanish Painters and Sculptors of 1724, Antonio Palomino observes, Ribera did not enjoy painting sweet and devout subjects as much as he liked expressing horrifying and harsh things, such as the bodies of old men, dry, wrinkled, and lean, with gaunt and withered faces, everything done accurately after the model, with extraordinary skill, vigor, and elegant technique. This is manifested by the Martyrdom of St Bartholomew, in which he is being flayed and the internal anatomy of the arm is exposed, by the celebrated Titius, whose entrails are being devoured by a vulture as a punishment for his wanton audacity, and by the torments of Sisyphus, Tantalus, and Ixion. Above all, Ribera was especially interested in the tradition and the challenge of depicting the suffering human body. Men tied to trees comprise approximately 1/4 of Ribera's drawings, half of which represent the martyrdoms of particular saints. This lecture will provide an introduction to Ribera's drawings by exploring some of the leitmotifs in his graphic production: grotesque heads, martyred saints, torture scenes, and bound figures. It will demonstrate how these works reveal an underlying tension between the beauty and sophistication of the drawing medium and the ugliness and violence of the subject matter, arguing that this tension is a defining characteristic of Ribera's artistic practice. After moving permanently to Naples, Ribera embarked on a short-lived career as a printmaker. Among his earliest etchings are 3 plates depicting studies of eyes, ears, the nose, and mouth. Beyond their intended function as part of a pattern book or drawing manual for beginning artists, the prints explicitly relate to the senses of sight, hearing, smell, and taste. In his studies of the nose and mouth, Ribera transforms the generic into the specific. He pushes the boundaries of the pattern book by exploring not only physiognomy, but also expression in the portrayal of open, screaming mouths. This is a motif to which returns for the figure of the suffering Marsyas in his painting of Apollo and Marsyas on view upstairs. In addition to their allusions to smell and taste, these open and closed mouths may be related to the contrast between sound and silence. Furthermore, Ribera introduces a notably grotesque element by adding hair-sprouting warts to nose and chin, a feature which is even more prominent in the small and the large grotesque head. Executed in the same year as the anatomical prints, both of these etchings depict figures suffering from large growths around the neck, and whose deformities Ribera seems to exacerbate by adding extra warts and ballooning the size of the tumors. When viewed in connection with the anatomical studies, whose references to the 5 senses are explicit, perhaps the 2 grotesque heads can also be read as a commentary on sensory extremes, specifically the extremes of sight and touch. While the precise function of these prints is unknown, the 18th century Italian biographer, Bernardo de Dominici, observes that the artist made some prints of grotesque heads as a joke or for fun. De Dominici himself owned 2 drawings of grotesque heads by Ribera, one in pen and ink and another in black chalk. Several examples of such drawings in various media survive, and we will turn to these in more detail during our tour of the exhibition. After having tested and mastered the process of etching in his anatomical studies in grotesque heads, Ribera executed one of his most ambitious prints, the Martyrdom of St Bartholomew. A small preparatory drawing in pen and ink in the British Museum records the artist's initial conception of the central group. Ribera clearly privileged the portrayal of this gruesome scene, since it is the only one of his prints to bear a dedication. The inscription reads that Ribera has dedicated his works and this print to the most serene Prince Filiberto, giving the etching pride of place among the artist's works as a whole. The dedicatee, Prince Filiberto of Savoy, was a nephew of Philip III of Spain, and in 1622 he was appointed Viceroy of Sicily. If, as this dedication suggests, Ribera was attempting to secure the prince's patronage, it was to no avail, as Filiberto died of bubonic plague the same year the print was executed. St. Bartholomew, the apostle and missionary who was skinned alive for his Christian faith, was indeed one of Ribera's favored subjects. Like the print, this ink and wash drawing at the Morgan Library in New York depicts a saint with limbs outstretched, gazing heavenward as he is brutally martyred. Compositionally, the drawing bears a certain resemblance to Ribera's monumental painting of the Martyrdom of St Bartholomew in Barcelona, signed and dated 1644. Note the similar pose of the principal executioner, who extends his right arm to flay the saint, while turning his head in the opposite direction. The printed design of 1624, though in reverse and conceived many years earlier, may ultimately have served as a model for this drawing. At the right of the sheet, the shadowy silhouette of a knife sharpener emerges, while on a rock below him are placed a knife and what appears to be a whip, or, more likely, an instrument to sharpen the knife. As you see here in this drawing, or rather print, of Bartholomew, and in this sheet here in Christchurch Picture Gallery. And stages of the martyrdom. Yet Ribera has deviated from the printed composition slightly by including for the first time 2 executioner's assistants. He has also shifted the ghostly onlookers, described in pale wash, from the center to the far left. The summary strokes at the lower center of the sheet suggest the marble bust fragment that Ribera usually includes, symbolizing the idol of Baldac that Bartholomew had shattered and prefiguring the saint's imminent beheading. The inscription below is not in Ribera's hand, as neither the calligraphy nor the orthography is consistent with Ribera's typical signature. He normally employed the Aragonese Valencian form of his name, Jusepe, except in Latin signatures when he used Joseph. Instead, the inscription in Italian was probably added by a later Italian owner of the sheet. The style of the drawing corresponds to Ribera's later style of draftsmanship, for example, the thin, tremulous lines that delineate the body of the saint and the reliance on wash to enliven the composition. The inscribed date of 1649 thus seems a reliable indicator when situating the drawing within Ribera's graphic oeuvre. While the function of the drawing is difficult to determine, the finished quality of the composition, as well as the presence of the inscription, suggest that it may have been executed on commission or conceived as a gift. Of all the sacred and secular representations of bound figures by Ribera, Saint Sebastian is the one which appears most frequently. More than a dozen drawn studies of the martyr by Ribera's hand survive. He also features in numerous paintings and perhaps the artist's first attempt at printmaking. The popularity of the saint can partly be explained by his being invoked as a protector during times of plague, which were frequent in the 17th century. Moreover, during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the saint served as a convenient subject for academic studies of the nude male body. A Roman soldier sentenced to death in the 4th century for his conversion to Christianity, Sebastian was shot with arrows and then miraculously restored to health, only to be martyred again at a later date when he was beaten to death with cudgels. Ribera's drawings typically represent Sebastian with his underarm exposed, revealing his vulnerability, as in this striking example in the Cleveland Museum of Art. The only depiction of the saint by Ribera in red chalk accented with brown ink. This sheet exhibits the saint's virtuosity in combining media. Here, the ink serves to reinforce the outline of the figure and to create visual accents. The blasted end of the tree trunk is executed solely in ink, and the rough texture of the bark contrasts with the smooth skin of the saint. Ribera suppresses narrative in this sheet in order to focus on the iconic image of the bound figure. Subtly rendered and starkly illuminated, Sebastian gazes heavenward at a divine light that bathes his body. The arched pose of the saint echoes the diagonal accent of the tree trunk slicing across the page. Despite the apparent simplicity of the composition, the sophisticated execution of the drawing reveals the complexity of Ribera's images of bound figures in general. In this drawing in the Princeton University Art Museum, a vertical tree trunk bisects the image. Sebastian, portrayed in profile, is neither bound with ropes nor pierced by arrows, but rather being prepared for martyrdom as a crouching figure binds his legs. Tilting the dome of his head toward the spectator, Sebastian raises his right arm in the air and points down with his left, extending his index finger to the ground. Given the sketchy nature of the sheet, which is characteristic of Ribera's preparatory drawings, it has been suggested that this work is a preliminary study for lost painting by the artist. In addition to scenes of religious martyrdom, Ribera also portrayed subjects of mythological violence. This sheet of studies in the British Museum may be preparatory for a lost painting of Titius. Another later drawing of the same subject is in the Istituto Centrale per la Grafica in Rome. Although several depictions of Titius by Ribera are documented, only 2 autograph paintings survive. One, formerly in the Johnson collection, probably dating from about 1620, and now in Italy, and the other in the Prado, dated 1632, where it is displayed with its pendant, Ixion. The Furias, as they are known in Spanish, or the 4 great sinners, Titius, Ixion, Tantalus, and Sisyphus, appear in Ovid's Metamorphoses and other classical sources. They were sentenced to an eternity of suffering in the classical underworld of Tartarus, where each was forced to endure a different form of torture. Punished for his attempted rape of Leto, Titius was condemned to have a vulture feast daily upon his entrails, which then regrew overnight to provide fresh food the following day. In this drawing, a bird pecks at the innards of a nude male figure lying on the ground, and related studies of the same figure appear in the lower left and right zones of the sheet. Ribera does not provide enough detail to determine whether the figure depicted is Titius or Prometheus. However, there is no evidence that Ribera ever portrayed Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from Zeus and suffered the same fate of being tormented daily by an eagle that fed on his regenerating liver. Ribera's conception of Titius may be traced back to the Hellenistic sculpture of the Laocoon. Discovered in Rome in 1506, the sculpture group had a profound impact on artists from Michelangelo onwards. It represents the Trojan priest, Laocoon, who warned the citizens of Troy not to accept the wooden horse designed as an offering to the goddess Athena, but which, in fact, concealed Greek warriors. When the gods saw their plans of destroying Troy foiled, they summoned 2 enormous sea serpents to suffocate the priest and his 2 sons. The Laocoon depicts this dramatic moment of bodily constriction, resistance, and pain. Ribera would certainly have been able to see the sculpture firsthand while he was in Rome. Around the same time that he made the painting of Titius in the Prado, Ribera executed a drawing of the Laocoon. From the end of the 16th century, the Laocoon was considered to represent the ultimate expression of physical pain and suffering, and therefore it was an appropriate model for his images of the Furias. Another important source was Titian's series of the Furias, commissioned by Mary of Hungary and executed in 1548. Significantly, this was the first time that they were depicted as a group. Titian's Titius was engraved by Cornelius Cort, and this printed design was subsequently copied by Martino Rota in 1570. Indeed, the orientation of Ribera's London Titius corresponds to Rota's engraving, which inverts Cort's already revised composition, or rather reversed composition, back to the original orientation of Titian's painting. After having conceived the principal figure, Ribera began to experiment with alternative configurations of his suffering body. The suggestion that these smaller studies followed the larger one is supported by their physical location around the giant in the lower corners of the sheet. Together with the more fully executed and larger figure, these summary sketches contribute to the sense of endless torture that the giant must endure as he twists on the ground, writhing in agony. In contrast to the Rome drawing, where the position of the figure is more fully resolved, in the London sheet, Ribera concentrates on exploring various poses and viewpoints of the suffering Titius. The artist may have in fact rotated the page as he was experimenting with different positions of the figure, which creates the effect of him tumbling in space. He may have worked from a posed model lying on the ground, and he employed the motif in other works, such as the New York Study for a Crucifixion of St. Peter on the left, and the Rome Apollo and Marsyas on the right. Indeed, the figure study at the left of this sheet, with his mouth wide open, anticipates Ribera's painting of the flaying of Marsyas, in which the satyr is portrayed facing the viewer, screaming in pain. Executed with a fine quill pen, This sheet of studies in Rome portrays two separate figures representing two different moments of torment. On the upper register lies the giant, chained to a rock with arms outstretched, echoing the widespread wings of the vulture, who swoops down to approach its victim. On the lower register, the bird's wings are even more outspread, its body even closer to the giant, who appears in an identical position, though here his head is not lifted up to observe the predator, but is thrust back as he howls in anguish. While at first glance it appears as if Ribera has adopted the second configuration in the paintings, in fact he represents the next stage in the process of torture. In the X. Johnson picture on the left, the bird appears with entrails hanging from its beak, and in the Prado version on the right, the vulture is depicted tugging with its beak on an intestinal cord. In contrast to the London Titius, where Ribera explores different poses and viewpoints of the figure, in the Rome drawing, the position of the protagonist is more fully resolved. The sheet is rather a compositional study in which the artist conceives the subject in a painterly manner. The combination of wash and parallel hatching foreshadows the dark, tenebrous ground of the paintings, and the reserve of paper is employed to illuminate the figure starkly. Cropped at the left, a single foot and a cancelled-out pair of legs above it indicate that Ribera had initially experimented with different positions of the figure in the opposite direction, as in the London sheet of studies. Scholars have considered the Rome drawing as preparatory for the Prado Titius. While the slightly more extended position of the figures in this sheet implies a progression toward the horizontal format of the Prado picture, the Rome drawing is actually more closely related to the composition of the much earlier X. Johnson painting. The style of the drawing places it clearly in the 1630s, thus complicating its relationship to the surviving pictures. It may be an independent study or preparatory for a lost painting. The problematic relationship between physical violence and its visual representation is further heightened in Ribera's Inquisition scene, currently in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. The cast here is restricted to three characters: the accused, suspended by his wrists in midair from a hoist, which acts as a visual framing device around the central action, the inquisitor, who interrogates the criminal, and the notary, who documents the proceedings. Unlike many of the artist's drawings depicting bound figures, this one does not represent a scene of execution, but rather of torture. The particular method portrayed, known as lo strappado in Italian or la garrucha in Spanish, involves tying the hands of the accused behind his back and then hanging him by his wrists from a rope on a hoist. Torture would begin immediately as the gravitational pull of the person's body slowly caused his shoulders to become dislocated. In order to relieve himself of the pain, the man in Ribera's drawing attempts to heave his body upwards. As a result of his struggling, the figure's trousers have become loosened. Indeed, he may be squirming to try and hold them up, but any attempt to save himself of further humiliation is in vain, for he has lost all control of his bodily functions and defecates on the ground. The strappado was a method of torture commonly employed in Ribera's time by the Inquisition as well as by the secular criminal courts in order to force confessions from accused criminals. A drawing of an interrogation scene in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge concentrates on the initial stages of the punishment. The kneeling figure may be interpreted as tying the rope to the hoist, and the suspended man's arms appear in a less advanced state of dislocation. It has been suggested that this drawing probably portrays a secular interrogation, as both the inquisitor and the notary wear large ruffs indicative of lay magistrates. By paring down the figural composition in the Rhode Island drawing, Ribera has transformed an open public spectacle that he could have witnessed into a private legal affair to which he would have not had access. Despite the excruciating pain of the strappado, the suspended figure's attention is in fact placed elsewhere, for he turns his head to engage with us directly. As he peers out into our space and we stare back at him, our roles are instantly reversed. The criminal transforms into a spectator, and we become the subject of his gaze. Is he looking to us for help? Or is he rather accusing us of having denounced him and thus having provoked his terrible fate? Like the suspended man, the inquisitor and notary play a prominent part in the scene, performing their respective roles of speaking and writing. However, in contrast to Ribera's print of the Martyrdom of St Bartholomew, for example, where the executioner is stripping the skin from the saint's arm, here the inquisitor does not personally carry out the task of torturing the criminal. There is a physical separation between the interrogator and the accused, who is being tortured not by human hands, but rather by the device of the strappado and the weight of his own body. As opposed to being equipped with the tools of an executioner, such as a knife or a sword, it is significant that in this drawing, the inquisitor is clutching a pen and paper, suggesting that, like the secretary behind him, he too may note down some aspect of the interrogation. The seated monk-like figure, portrayed with a hint of a pen in his right hand, is no doubt a notary of the secreto, whose job it was to record meticulously every word muttered and gesture made during the trial process. In fact, the notary may not only write, but also draw what lies before him, thus creating an intimate parallel with the artist himself, who executes this image of torture. The practice of documenting contemporary modes of violence in visual form was not limited to the sketchbooks of professional artists, but can also be observed in the margins of criminal testimonies. An exhibition in 2001 at the Archivio di Stato in Rome brought to light many official tribunal documents from the 17th century on which are crudely scrawled images of torture and execution. Notaries would write in volumes of narrow format during the official proceedings and larger format when recopying afterwards, executing rapid marginal sketches in the former, followed by more detailed drawings in the latter. Significantly, for our purposes, one example of the first type, that rapid type, dated 1596, shows repeated drawings of the strappado. See, the figures are being suspended by the wrists here. And these are whips, indicating a different form of punishment. The tribunal documents in question not only contain drawings of torture, but also of execution. Burning at the stake was the ultimate penalty, reserved in this period for those who committed crimes of sodomy, heresy, apostasy, sacrilege, and witchcraft. In this larger volume, dated 1614, marginal sketches of burning and flogging appear on the same page, both drawings relating to the sentence of Andrea Pacini, who was convicted of sodomy. On the upper register is scrawled Pacini's body, bound to the stake and engulfed in flames. On the lower register is depicted his lover, Camillo di Jacopo di Vicovaro, who was condemned to witness Andrea set alight and then was publicly flogged, branded, and expelled from the city. In a drawing of a similar subject now in San Francisco and on view in the exhibition, Ribera seems to bridge the gap between the practices of torture documentation and artistic representation. Like his Inquisition scene, the man bound to a stake portrays a moment of intense suffering as the bodily weight of the chained figure gradually pulls him down and the cord tied to his neck begins to strangle him. The artist has foreshadowed the victim's fate, for the uneven lines at the bottom of the page signify a pyre that will be ignited. It is curious that Ribera has chosen to sign this drawing. The large, individually formed letters, boldly spelling out his name and nationality, almost rival in importance with the bound figure. Given the prominence of the signature, we could suggest that it not only confirms the work's authenticity, Jusepe de Ribera Español made this drawing, but also asserts that the artist may have in fact witnessed the event. Jusepe de Ribera Español was here. Indeed, the image of Ribera as an observer of reality, as opposed to the caricature of him as a sadistic personality, carries more weight when considering his torture drawings within a wider contemporary context of recording violent scenes not only textually, but also pictorially. Unlike the tribunal documents, however, which detail every aspect of an individual's trial, in Ribera's Inquisition scene, despite the specificity of the torture device portrayed, the identity of the criminal, the exact nature of his crime, and the particular institution that is judging him remain to be clarified. Given Ribera's geographical movements from Spain to Rome and eventually Naples, the strappado was certainly a form of torture which he would have been able to see. In his 1634 publication, Il Forastiero, the lawyer Giulio Cesare Capaccio writes of the different types of torture and execution exhibited outside the Tribunale della Vicaria. listing the horrific sights and sounds to which he exposed himself when going there daily, only per curiosità. Though the strappado is not explicitly mentioned in Carpaccio's text, it does, however, appear in a painting of the Vicaria by an anonymous 17th century artist. This work gives us an insight into the violent scenes of everyday life that Ribera and his contemporaries would have witnessed. The strappado was designed not only to torture physically, but also to expose and shame publicly the accused by raising him high above the ground for all to bear witness. Beyond its expression of power, it was equally intended to strike fear in the masses by sending out a message of warning. That person up there could be you. A related interpretation of the bound man theme can be found in Ribera's red chalk drawing of an old man tied to a tree in the Courtauld Gallery in London. Here the artist fully exploits his mastery at depicting an elderly figure in a complicated pose with twisting limbs. Ribera rhymes body parts to tree parts, torso to trunk, limb to branch. He also pushes the boundaries of mimetic representation, demonstrating what drawing can achieve that cannot be done in nature. The position of the central figure is difficult, if not anatomically impossible, to recreate, and the artist has exaggerated the proportions of the body, elongating his extended arm and leg. The identity of the bound man in this drawing is the subject of debate. One art historian claimed that it represents St. Bartholomew, an identification retained by subsequent scholars, in spite of the fact that his essential attribute of the knife is absent. Two studies of St. Sebastian that we've seen already in the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Princeton University Art Museum are similar in medium and handling. But the balding, bearded figure in the Courtauld sheet is clearly an elderly man. Ribera was apparently less concerned with depicting a specific figure or establishing an iconography for a particular saint, and more preoccupied with exploring the possibilities of representing the contorted male body under torture. Ribera's sketches of bound men have been loosely related by scholars to the tradition of the academy drawing. If the sheet is rotated horizontally, it becomes apparent that Ribera may have started to draw this figure from a posed model lying on the ground. The ostensibly beseeching gesture of the arm can equally be read as reaching upwards when the page is turned, and this raised arm can be found in several paintings by the artist. For example, the Martyrdom of St Bartholomew in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. Likewise, when viewed horizontally, the back of the figure is inclined at a similar angle to that of St. Sebastian in paintings of St. Sebastian tended by St. Irene in Bilbao and St. Petersburg. Although the position of the left arm does not suggest a model resting on the ground, it is possible that Ribera may have worked after life only in part, at once imitating and adapting the human form. A potential compositional model for the figure is Domenichino's fresco of the flagellation of St. Andrew in the oratory of San Andrea at San Gregorio Magno in Rome, which Ribera must have seen when he was in the city. There's St. Andrew there. One of the most intriguing aspects of this drawing is the ambiguous relationship between the bound man and the seated figure. Ribera's rendering of that figure is so subtle that the clue seems to lie in his pose and the object on which he is sitting. It may be argued that this figure is not simply resting, but actually defecating. The object on the ground appears to be a bucket or chamber pot, its rounded handle visible at the back. The figure's breeches seem to be loose, and he may, in fact, be holding his shirt tails in his hands. The arched back of the figure and his location at the base of the tree are comparable with the print of a defecating man from Jacques Callot's Capricci di varie figure series, lending further support to this interpretation. Now, scatological subjects are not out of character in Ribera's torture drawings, as we have observed in his Inquisition scene. Despite the seriousness of the subject, its mocking tone becomes apparent when relating the corpulence of the notary to the excretion of the accused, and when considering the irony of the situation. The inquisitor wants a confession, and all he gets is shit. The connection between defecation and humor had long since been made in the genre of caricature. For example, the sheet of studies ascribed to Agostino or Annibale Carracci, which depicts a puto defecating on an altar. But how might this interpretation inform our reading of the Courtauld drawing? Typologically, the defecating man here can be associated with a Spanish cagané, a figurine that appears in cribs in Spain and Naples during the early modern period in the act of defecation. Such a motif is thus not unsuited to a religious scene. Proverbial language may also provide a context for interpreting the subject matter of this sheet. One Spanish proverb runs, El estiércol no es santo, mas do cae hace milagro. Dung is no saint, but where it falls, it works miracles. The visual opposition between the saintly man and the defecating figure recalls the play of opposites that defines the burlesque poetry of Francesco Berni. Ribera may have known his Capitolo del Orinale, which elevates the rank of the lowly urinal beside it. I mean, besides urine, there are nearly 100. And first of all, I should say it should be known that the urinal is round, the better to hold more things. It is made just like the world, for the fact that it has a circular shape means that it has no ending or bottom. Everyone who knows how to build walls knows this, and everyone who understands architecture, which teaches one how to measure things. Like Berni's poem, Ribera's drawing combines the serious and the satirical, the high and the low, revealing the subtlety of his torture drawings, which operate on multiple levels. To conclude, the relationship between the sublime and the grotesque in Ribera's art continued to generate commentaries in the 19th century. In Lord Byron's epic poem of 1823, Don Juan, Ribera makes a brief but significant appearance. When describing a picture gallery at Norman Abbey in his 14th canto, Byron writes, quote, of martyrs awed, as Spagnoletto tainted his brush with all the blood of all the sainted. Spagnoletto, of course, refers to the nickname given to Ribera in Italy, and the French echo of these verses clearly resonates in the lines of Théophile Gautier, who, in 1845, dedicated a sonnet to this painting of Titius in the Prado, exclaiming, "You, cruel Ribera, harsher than Jupiter, from his hollow sides you make flow in streams of blood by way of horrible cuts, cascades of intestines." Historically, there has been a tendency to assume that because Ribera produced such violent imagery, he too must have had a violent personality. Unlike Caravaggio the murderer and Tassi the rapist, however, there is no documentary evidence for Ribera as criminal or sadist. Ribera did not necessarily have to be a sadist in order to produce these works, and I would tend to agree with Manuela Mena, who states that, quote, the idea of Ribera as an unbalanced personality, prone to cruelty, is a superficial explanation for works that are indisputably well within a tradition that culminates in the 18th century with the Venetian Capriccio. The issue of representing saintly martyrdom was of great importance during the Counter-Reformation. At the final session of the Council of Trent in 1563, the assembled bishops insisted upon re-establishing the veneration of the saints. Ribera's visceral depictions of religious violence, therefore, responded directly to the call for images that would inspire piety by arousing emotion in the spectator. As a realist artist, Ribera was an acute observer of the world around him. In contrast to his public-facing prints and paintings, the world of drawing provides a window onto his private sphere. The Inquisition scene and man bound to a stake testify to the artist's role not only as a recorder and manipulator of reality, but also as a witness to the acts of corporal violence of his time. Above all, Ribera's images were designed to create a profound impact on the spectator through their subject matter, material execution, and artistic conception. The powerful and violent themes that permeate his art enabled Ribera to exploit his virtuosity not only as a painter and printmaker, but also as a master of drawing, creating works at once sublime and grotesque, which demonstrate his unrivaled skills as a leading graphic artist of his age. Thank you very much.